In this tutorial, I'm going to step you through how to make a flashcards app. So first of all, I'm going to type in hola and hello for one pair of terms and definitions. And then I'll also put in gracias and thanks and adios and bye. Now if I click this practice button, I get taken to the flashcard screen, where I can go through my cards and click on them to flip them over, and click next card to go to the next one. Then it brings up this pop-up to tell me when I finished all my cards. Now say when I'm playing again, I decide that I really have the word gracias down. Then I can click remove this card, in which case it will get rid of that card and move on to the next one. Let's start by designing the first page, which will allow the user to add new cards to their list of flashcards and to start practicing. I'll add a label first that tells them to add a card. Now I'm going to want to have two text boxes, one for the term and one for the definition, and then also an add button. So that those can be all side by side, I'm going to use a horizontal layout. That's going to be under layout and horizontal arrangement. Now I need to put those three elements into here. So I'm going to go back to user interface and then drag two text boxes in. And before I can put in the button, I'll need to make these a little bit smaller, and I can do that by going under width and changing this from automatic to about 40% works well for me. And I'll do that for the other one as well. Now I'm also going to change the hint. The hint is what appears in light gray text in the background of the box that tells the user what's supposed to go there. So for text box 1, I'm going to make the hint term, and then for the second one, I'm going to make it definition. Note that you can't actually see any change on the screen here, but if you run it on a device, you'll see the change. I'll also get the button and put that at the end and make this say add. Now it looks a little funky here and it's a little out of place, but if you try it on a phone again, you'll see that this does work. We also need another button that will allow the user to start practicing. So I'll bring another button down and change the text to practice. Finally, we need a component called TinyDB. TinyDB acts as a database for one specific person that allows you to remember aspects of how they interact with the app over multiple occasions. And that's going to be important here because if the user puts in some flashcards on Monday, we want to make sure that we remember those on a Tuesday and we don't completely forget what they put in the next time they use the app. So to get TinyDB, that's going to be under Storage and TinyDB. Alright, so now let's go to blocks. First of all, we're going to want a list that will keep track of all the cards. The way this list will be formatted is it's actually going to be a list of lists. So each element is a list with two elements inside of that. One is going to be the term and one is going to be the definition. So we're going to need a global variable to represent that. I'll go to variables and choose initialize global name to. This is the name of our variable, which I will make cards. At the beginning, there aren't any cards, so that's just going to be an empty list. I'll go to lists and choose create an empty list. Now the thing is, if this is the first time you're using the app, this is in fact going to be an empty list. But say we played this app on a Monday and now we're coming back on a Tuesday. For cards, we actually want this to include anything that they put in on Monday. And so like I said, we're going to be storing those in TinyDB. However, we can't directly start cards off to be the value from TinyDB because App Inventor doesn't allow that. So what we need to do instead is say when the screen initializes, then we'll go grab out that component from TinyDB and stick it into cards. So to see when the screen initializes, you're going to click on screen 1 and choose when screen1.initialize. Then we're going to set the value of cards. So if you mouse over cards, you'll be able to get set. And we want to go retrieve that value from TinyDB. So let's go to TinyDB and get value. Our tag, I'm just going to use the word cards. I'm just going to drag this text box up here and make this cards. And value of tag not there, that means if we haven't yet added anything to our list, and if this is the first time we're playing the app. In that case, we want it to be an empty list. So I'll go to lists and choose create empty list. Now we need to code what happens if they click that add button. That's the one right here. So in that case, we need to make sure we're updating all of our variables to make sure we're taking in that new card. So to see when they click the button, let's go to button 1 and choose when button1.click. Then we're going to want to add that new card to our list of cards. So let's go to list and choose add items to list. The list is cards, so I'm going to mouse over here and choose Get Global Cards. And the item, like I said, this is going to be a list with two elements. One is a term and one is a definition. So to put those in their own smaller lists, we'll need to go to Lists and choose Make a List. And this already has two things right here. So the first thing will make the text in text box 1. So we go to text box 1 and choose dot text. And I'm going to copy and paste this for the second one and just change it to text box 2. Now we also want to set the text in those text boxes to be blank so that they don't have to keep backspacing them when they want to put in another card. So I'll go to this again, and instead of getting just textbox1.text, I'll choose set textbox1.text. And we want that to just be blank, so we can go to text and choose the empty text. And I'm going to copy and paste this and change it to text box 2 for the other one. Here I'm also going to update TinyDB. So let's go ahead and get TinyDB, and instead of choosing get value, I'm going to get the store value one and just put that right below here. The tag, because we use cards over here, we're going to want that to be the same tag so that we're referencing the same object in that memory. So I'm going to go to text, choose this one, and make it cards. And the value to store is just our list of cards, Get Global Cards. So I'm going to copy and paste this and pull it down. Finally, we need to code what happens when they click the practice button. So let's go to button 2 and choose when button2.click. Then we're going to want to open that practice screen. So let's go to Control, scroll all the way down to the bottom, and there's Open Another Screen. We haven't actually created this screen yet, so let's go ahead and do that by clicking on Add Screen. And I'm just going to call it Practice. Once you create that screen, it will take a few seconds, but then it will bounce you over here, so you'll need to switch back to screen 1 by going up here and choosing screen 1. And going back to blocks, we can now add in the screen name. So I'll go to text, choose the empty one, and put in practice. Alright, so now we can go to screen 2. I'll go back to Designer. So at the top we want a back button that they can click once they're done practicing. So I'm going to bring a button down and make the text back. Now the main portion of the screen is going to be taken up by the actual flashcard. I'm going to make that a button so that it's clickable. So we can bring the button down. It doesn't look much like a flashcard initially, so we'll want to change that. The background color, you can make anything you want, but I'm going to make it pink. And then we'll want to make it bigger, so I'm going to make the width fill parent. That's going to mean it stretches all the way across the screen. And then the height I'll make maybe 50%. Okay, so that's a good size flashcard. We're not going to change how it says text for button 2 right now because we don't know yet what we want to display on the flashcard. We'll have to do that in the code so that it's based on what cards they added on the previous screen. You might want to play around with the font size here though, so maybe make it a little bit bigger because it's a pretty big flashcard. Now we want two buttons at the bottom. One will give the user the option to remove a card if they feel like they understand the meaning now, and the other one will allow them to go on to the next card. Just as we did on the previous screen, I'm going to put those in a horizontal arrangement so they can be side by side. I'm going to also rename these buttons so that once we're in the code, we'll know what we're dealing with. So I'm going to make this one remove, and then I'll also change the text to remove this card. And then for the other one, I'm going to rename this next, and I'll change the text to next card. Note that the user can't actually tell what we name these buttons, but it'll just be really helpful to us when we're in the blocks so that we don't have to be confused about which one was button 3 and which one was button 4. We also need to add a notifier so that we can bring up the pop-up that tells them once they've finished all of their cards. So I'm going to drag the notifier onto the screen. Note that it goes under non-visible components because it's not always visible on the screen. We also need a TinyDB on the screen as well so that we can access those things that we put into memory. So let's go to Storage and choose TinyDB. Note that even though we have to drag this TinyDB over twice, once on each screen, it is still referring to the same TinyDB object. So this TinyDB knows about everything that we put into the other one. Let's now go to the code. So for variables, we're again going to want to have a cards list. So I'm going to go to variables and choose this one and make it cards and make it an empty list. We're also going to want to have a variable to represent the card that we're currently at. And the reason why is we're going to need to randomize the order in which we see these cards. We don't always want to deliver the cards in exactly the same order because then it becomes repetitive. So what we're going to do instead is at the very beginning, we're going to retrieve the list of cards that we have from TinyDB. And then we'll keep randomly picking a card from that list of cards, and each time we do so, we'll delete it from that list so that we make sure we don't pick it again. You can kind of think of this as if we put a whole bunch of the cards in a hat and then we draw them out one by one and put them aside after we're done. It's the same concept here. And the reason why we need to have this outside variable instead of just using TinyDB is that even if we need to remove them this round, that doesn't mean we want to forget about it altogether, because if they try going through the flashcards a separate day, we need to remember that that card is still there. It's like putting all the flashcards back into the hat when we're done. So just like we have this cards variable, we're also going to need to have card, which keeps track of which card we're looking at right now. So I'm just going to copy and paste this and change this to card. Now, first of all, the most basic thing is to code our back buttons, that once they click the back button, they go back to the first screen. Let's go ahead and do that. So click on button 1, and this is just going to be when button1.click. We will want to open the other screen. So this will be open another screen, and the screen name for me is screen 1. So I'll go to text and do screen 1. Now, just like on the previous screen, how we had this cards variable that we initially made an empty list, but when the screen opened, we got the value from TinyDB. That's going to be the same thing here. So when the screen initializes, let's get that code, we are going to set cards to be that value from TinyDB. So I'll mouse over this and get set global cards 2, and then we can go to TinyDB and do the get value. The tag is going to be cards, and the value, if not there, is that empty list. At this point, we're going to want to have some process that will set up a new card for them to see. We're actually going to need to repeat that process in a few different locations, so I'm going to use a procedure for that. I'm not going to fill out the procedure now, we'll just assume that it works, and then we'll come back to it later. So I'm going to go to procedures and do toProcedureDo. Make sure you don't get the lower one. This is if we want to return a result. But in this case, we just want to carry out a process. So I'm going to bring this here and make the procedure new card. And like I said, we'll leave it empty for now and make sure to come back to it later. So here I will just call that procedure by doing call new card, and we'll assume that sets up a new card. Now let's figure out what we need to do when they click the other buttons. First, what happens if they click the card itself, and that was button 2. Let's get the when button2.click. When they click the card, we want to reveal what the answer was. And although that will look like flipping over the card, in reality what we're just going to do instead is to fetch that definition from card. Now this is why we have this separate card variable. This is going to be itself a list where the first thing is the term and the second thing is a definition. So when we first show the card, we're going to be showing the first element of the list. And now what we're going to want to do is just to change it to the second element of the list. So to do that, let's go under button 2, and then we're going to want to change the text. So that will be set button2.text 2. And then we're going to need to select an item out of this card list. So let's go to list and choose select list item. The list is card. And the index is asking what position we're at, where the first position is 1, the second position is 2, etc. We want to look at position 2 because that's going to be where the definition is. So let's go to math and choose that number and make it 2. Now something else that we need to do is we want to make sure that the user can't go on to the next card until they've flipped over the current card, and that they can't flip over the card again until they've gone on to the next card. So to make sure they can't do that, we're going to be kind of toggling whether the card and the next button are enabled or disabled. So now, because they just clicked on the card, we want to make sure that they can't click it again, because who knows what will happen if we're currently looking at the definition and they haven't yet gone to the next card and they try to flip the card over again. That won't really work. So we now want to disable button 2. So to do that, let's go under button 2 and choose set button2.enabled to, and this will be false because we want it to not be enabled. Then we want to make our next button enabled. So we'll copy and paste this and make this next and make it enabled. And so that's all we need to do for that. Let's now figure out what to do when the next button is clicked. So we're going to choose when next.click. Then we need to make sure that we're re-enabling the flashcard because we would have disabled the flashcard button there and now we want to enable it. So I'm going to do Command V to pull this one down again and make it true. And then we're going to want to call that new card function because if they hit the next button, we're going to bring up another card. So I'll go to Procedures and choose New Card. Finally, we need to code what happens when they click the Remove button. So let's go ahead and choose that. When we click it, we actually are going to need to modify what's stored in TinyDB now, because this isn't just removing the card for this game, this is removing it completely so that we're never again going to see this card. So to do that, we need to fetch what's in TinyDB and then remove the card from that and stick that back into TinyDB. I'm going to store that temporary list in a local variable. So I'm going to go to Variables and choose Initialize a local name to, and I'll make this Modified Cards. We're going to start it out as what's in TinyDB. So I'll go to TinyDB and do get value. The tag is cards. The value, if not there, is an empty list. Then we're going to want to remove that card from the list. So I'm going to go to lists and get the remove function, which is here. The list is modified cards. And we don't know what the index is initially, but we can figure out where card is in our list with a method here. If we go under list, there's one that's index in list, and that's going to tell us where the card is in the list. So we can bring that down, and the thing is our card. So I'm going to go to variables and choose get, and make this card. Make sure you don't choose cards, because we're just looking at the one card that we're trying to remove. And our list is modified cards. And now that we have this list that has that one card removed, we can stick it back into TinyDB. So that's going to involve storing the value. Our tag is cards. I'm copying and pasting this. And our value is just modified cards. Like we did before, we're going to call this new card function so that because they've removed this card, we don't want to see it anymore. We want to bring up a new card. So let's go to Procedures and do New Card. Let's get back to this new card function that we've been talking about to make sure it actually works. So we define it up here. The main thing that we need to do is to, first of all, we need to randomly pick one of our flashcards from our list of cards. So let's do that. I'm going to go into Variables and choose Set, and this is going to be setting the card variable. And we want this to be a random item from our list. So I'll go to Lists and choose Pick a Random Item. And the list is cards, so that will be get cards. Then, to ensure that we never pick this card again, we're going to need to delete it from our list of cards. This is going to be exactly the same process that we did before with the remove function, just on a different list. So I'll go to Lists and do Remove List Item. The list is cards. And then again, to get the index, we're going to need to get that find index function, which is here. The thing is card. I'm just going to paste this and change it to card. And then the list is cards. Now we need to make sure that the button shows the correct new term. So let's go to button 2 and set the text. Now you'll remember when we wanted to flip over the card over here, we got the second index. Now we're going to get the first index, which has the term. I'm going to copy and paste this to bring it over, but I'll just change this index from 2 to 1 so we're getting the first thing in it. And now we're going to need to enable this button 2 so that it will be clickable so they can flip it over. So I'll go to button 2 and do .enabled2 and make it true. And then we want to disable the next button because we don't want them to go on to the next card until they've turned over this one. So I'll copy and paste this and change it from button 2 to next and make this false. Now this is what we want to do most of the time, but there are going to be a few cases where we don't want to do this. One thing is, what if they've removed every single card and they now have nothing left in TinyDB? That's going to be a problem because they're going to try to pick an item from an empty list and that won't work. So let's first cover the case where they've removed everything. We'll need an if statement for that. And the case will be if the length of the TinyDB list is 0. So to check for equality, I'll do math. We'll need to put a 0 on one side. And then on the other side, we'll need the length of what's in TinyDB. So I'm going to get the list length function, which is here, and then I'll get what's in TinyDB. That's going to be with getValue, and the tag is cards. In that case, we want to give them a notifier to tell them what happened and then push them back onto the first screen so that they have to put in new cards. They won't try to play the game when they don't have any cards left. So I'm going to go to notifier 1 and choose show message dialog. The message will be you ran out of cards. The title will just be alert. And I'll make the button text back to home screen. And now we need to actually put them on the home screen, so I'll push them back there by going to Control and choosing Open Another Screen, and the screen name is Screen 1. Another case we need to consider is if they ran out of cards not because they deleted them all, but because they've gone through the entire set. So they looked at every card that they had and tried it out with a flashcard. That's also going to be a problem because now our cards list is empty. So to check for that, it's going to be a very similar thing, but instead of looking at TinyDB, I'll just be looking at our cards list. I'm going to add an else if statement, which is like an if statement, but it only runs if the previous one wasn't true. So I'm going to go under here and drag in an else if. Then I'm just going to copy and paste this for now because it's going to be a similar structure, but I'll get rid of this TinyDB component and instead just do global cards. Again, we're going to want a notifier, so I'll copy and paste this, but I'll change it to something else different. So I'll say you finished all of your cards, and then the title will be congrats, and I'll make the button text play again. This is key, so now instead of pushing them back to the first screen, we'll just give them the option to play the game again. And in order to make sure that's all set up, I'm going to now reset cards to be what's stored in TinyDB. Because now it's an empty list, but we want to make sure we're getting that TinyDB value back out again. So I'll go to variables and choose set and make it set global cards, and that will be what's in TinyDB, which I can get just over here. And I'll bring that down. We still need to change something else because we want these parts over here to happen both when there's nothing out of the ordinary and this is just a typical going on to the next card, and also if they ran out of their cards list, but not their TinyDB. So I'm going to need to put an if statement around that as well. It's key to notice that the only time we don't want to do this is if their TinyDB is empty. So that means we want to do this when TinyDB is not empty. So all we need to do is to flip this from equals to not equals. I'm going to first grab an if statement from here, and then drag all this code in there. And then I'm going to copy and paste this part here and drag it down, but change this to not equals. And that's it. Congratulations on finishing your Flashcards app. I hope you learned something, and if you did, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe.